Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for What You Leave Behind, which is episode 25 and 26 of Season 7 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Deep Space Nine. As determined by my user polls, the episode to win my latest user poll for Deep Space Nine was the series finale, What You Leave Behind. So, What You Leave Behind is the episode that sees the end of the Dominion War as the Federation, Cardassian, and Romulan joint fleet closes on Cardassia, and a civil uprising led by Damar with help from Kieran Garrick surround Dominion headquarters. Dominion find themselves outnumbered, particularly when the Cardassians turn on them and start attacking their ships in orbit. The female changeling starts eradicating the Cardassian population, which is a disaster that Cardassia will take a long time to recover from. However, Odo beams down and links with her in order to convince her to stop and to surrender, and thus the war is over. Meanwhile, Dukat, along with Winn, decide to release the pod race from the fire caves, leading Cisco to try to stop them. And in order to stop them, he must sacrifice his life in order to defeat Dukat, and thus he actually survives, but goes off to live with the prophets to become a god, leaving Cassidy and her newborn baby, or about to be born baby, alone. And thus, the various members of Deep Space Nine go their separate ways. Worf becomes a Klingon ambassador, O'Brien goes back to Starfleet Academy, and Odo leaves to join his people in the Link. So, as I've talked about this episode in various other videos, this made my top 10 favorite Deep Space Nine episodes. This was number 3 on my favorite series finales of all time, behind All Good Things in the Breaking Bad finale. However, this would probably be bumped back to number 4, possibly number 5, because of the Expanse series finale and the Star Wars The Clone Wars series finale, which I just watched, so that might bump this back as well. However, it's still in the upper echelon of still top 5 series finales of all time. I think this is one of the best series finales of all time. I think I've talked about this in many videos, how ending a show and having the final episode is something a lot of shows just don't know how to handle, and they don't handle it very well. And the majority of shows actually fumble this. And so Voyager being the prime example of that. The worst, I saw this meme today that had like these 2 dragons that looked really fierce and awesome, and had this goofy cartoonish dragon next to it, and the 2 awesome dragons that said All Good Things, What You Leave Behind, and the goofy silly dragon that said These Are the Voyages, which is the Enterprise finale, which I disagree with that meme. I would take out These Are the Voyages and put in Endgame, which is a much worse finale, but I'm not here to rant about how that is the worst. Not only the worst series finale in Star Trek, but the worst series finale ever of anything. But I'm not here to rant about how horrible the Voyager finale was. And the Enterprise one, it's fine. It's not a good episode, but there's been way worse, such as the Voyager one was like 1 billion times worse. But anyway, it's pretty well agreed that this is a great finale. Many other fan sites have rated this as in the top 10 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I once did a live stream with fellow podcaster Wes from the Penske File, and we each had our various ratings of all the Deep Space Nine episodes, and he had also put this episode in his top 10 as well as I did. So it seems to be very commonly well-loved, well-liked series finale. Now, I think most people, however, would agree that All Good Things, the TNG finale, is better. maybe some might even say marginally better, but most agree it's better. Because there are some pitfalls of this finale. A lot of people would point to the Dukat and Kai Winn storyline, which I agree, maybe not, it wasn't the strongest, it wasn't the best, but me personally, anyone who's familiar with me and my channel knows exactly who I think ruined this finale. I'll give you a clue. His name starts with a V, and he loves to like sing horrible Frank Sinatra covers and takes up like 5 minutes of fucking screen time singing Frank Sinatra songs. I can't stand this character! And of course, he's easily the worst part. Sorry. He's easily the worst part of this finale and does in fact bring it down a bit. I will say though, had he been omitted, and in fact, even had they omitted the whole Dukat and Kai Winn thing, and the episode was just the Dominion stuff, and then just them saying their goodbyes, minus those cheesy montages because we're cutting out Vic Fontaine. But if it was just, and Cisco can go off to the Prophets. I don't really care about that one way and the other. That didn't bother me. Although his Prophet being a mother bothered me, but that wasn't even mentioned or relevant in this episode. So had this episode simply been like the first hour stuff, it was the Dominion stuff, and then them saying goodbye, such as the Kira and Odo goodbye scene, which, that's one of the best scenes in all of Star Trek, in my opinion. It really gets me most emotional scene. So had it just been that stuff, no cheesy montages, no Kai Winn Dukat bull BS, no fucking Vic Fontaine singing in the in the holosuites for 5 minutes, then this would easily be my favorite episode of the show. I would say, yeah, because I loved the Dominion portion of the story, and I loved the goodbyes. It's just the cheesy montages, the Vic Fontaine and the Dukat stuff. I didn't hate it. Like, had they kept the Dukat stuff in this, maybe I could have still considered this my favorite episode of the show, but the Vic Fontaine stuff easily disqualifies it from being my favorite episode of the show, but it's still top 10 for me. And the cheesy montages, that's over the top. That is unnecessary. We don't need that. Especially because they play it to Vic Fontaine stupid. Anyway, so, I think this was like the perfect way to end the Dominion War story arc, which had been going for 2 seasons. It does it in such a typically dark Deep Space Nine fashion. It's not the heroes win the day and the good guys defeat the bad guys and all is well, which is why a lot of I wouldn't say lesser war movies do, because I'm thinking of stuff like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, which are also really great, don't get me wrong, but they have no more of the good guys win. They defeat the evil bad guys. Where in real life, war is a lot more complicated and complex, and just war is bad overall. It's just, there's nothing good that could come out of it. It's something that should be avoided at all costs. And sometimes, such in the case of World War II, which I think the Dominion War takes a lot of its inspiration from. It's a necessary evil. Like, there's no way to avoid it. You can't just let these, powers that want to dominate the world, or in this case, the Alpha Quadrant or the galaxy, you can't just lay down and let them enact there where they would massacre people and run a totalitarian dictatorship society. You must fight back against that, but it's still not a good thing. It's still not, yay, good defeats evil. It's still more complex than that. Which this episode does an amazing job, which I think is very true to Deep Space Nine and everything it stood for and everything it's done for its run. It's always, and that's what even sets it apart from previous Star Trek series like the original series and Next Generation and Voyager, which was running concurrently with this, that it is a bit, it's known for being more gritty, but also really dealing with the harsh realities of life, rather than the original series. TNG and Voyager tend to show, not always, but they tend to show a more picturesque, idealistic version of society, which is fine. And to be fair and to be clear, a lot of cases I do agree with that idealism, but every once in a while you do need to be, tamper that idealism with realism, which is what Deep Space Nine does extremely well. And I love how, because, alright, so, Cisco and his Starfleet forces, they had this big, intense space battle with the Dominion, and, they fight their way to Cardassia, and they're there to free the Cardassian people, and the Cardassian people revolt. But in actuality, the Cardassians are massacred, and by the time they get to the planet, and their Cardassians are being killed by the thousands, possibly even by the millions, and they're stuck with this huge Dominion fleet protecting the planet, where they can't stop it from happening. So they're helpless while all these Cardassian civilians, innocent civilians, men, women, children, are getting slaughtered. And, the genocide is being committed, and they're just helpless to stop it. And it's because of Odo, of course, who, links with the changing, which, to be fair, I did think was kind of an easy way to stop this war. But had he not done that, the founder would have been very happy to just fight to the death, and have, all the Jem'Hadar and Breen would have, sacrificed themselves and killed even more of Starfleet's forces, where, in her words, victory would taste as every bit of bitter as defeat. And that's some dark shit. And even when they did convince her to stop, though, and not do that, it was still a very bittersweet victory, because all the lives that had been lost, the waste of life, and that's something that was very highlighted in this episode, that they did show that it was, rather than a typical yay, the good guys defeat the bad guys and good wins over evil, it's more of this is just a shit situation for everyone, and we just have to learn to move forward in the best way that we possibly can. And of course, this is sort of exemplified in the scene where because Cisco and Ross had made a bet with Martok who would get to Cardassia Prime first in the year previously, and they bet a barrel of blood wine. And of course, Cisco and Ross get there first, so Martok's like, alright, you win, here's your blood wine. He wants to drink to their victory, but they're not in the mood to drinking, because there's millions of dead Cardassian civilians lying at their feet. And Martok, and I love the nuance to this, because Martok is very rightfully points out, before you shed any tears, these are Cardassians. They committed mass genocide against the Bajorans, and they invaded their planet for 50 years, killed, tortured, raped their entire population, and just sucked out their resources. And so many Bajorans would refer to this as poetic justice. Yet, they're still innocent dead civilians. What their government and military had done in the past does not justify, two wrongs don't make a right. It does not justify this genocide, and it's still not something to be celebrated. And the episode itself is not saying that Martok is wrong, or morally wrong, or an asshole. It's just pointing out all the gray and nuance involved in that, and that is so Deep Space Nine. That's why this is the perfect ending for Deep Space Nine. This is the most Deep Space Nine D Space Nine ending that they could have for D Space Nine. And that's why it's perfect, and that's why I fucking love it. And then we get scenes such as, we follow for the past several episodes, and that's the other elephant in the room, is that this is actually the 10th episode in a 10 episode arc, yet it also serves kind of as a standalone finale, because when I watched this for this thing, I watched it out of context, although previously I'd seen the episodes. But it was easy enough for me, even though I remember what happened, it's still been a while, and it was easy enough for me to just pick up what was going on in this episode. And so I imagine there were people who actually just watched the final episode without watching the 8 previous episodes to this, and they still understood enough. Like, they might have been confused the fact that Kira was on the planet with Garrick and Damar and whatnot, but it was easy enough to pick up as you went along what was going on. But anyway, we followed Kira with, and the episodes leading up to this were amazing. Some of them attacking in the Winn in particular, you would also find in my top 10, because they did a great job of showcasing how Kira, a Bajoran terrorist who fought against the Cardassians, is now helping the Cardassians fight their own resistance against Dominion, and the irony involved in that, and how awesome that character development was. But here, they really build up Damar throughout these episodes to be this great man, the kind of man they need to lead a new Cardassia. And it feels like they're leading him to become this new leader, savior of Cardassia, who will save Cardassia from the Dominion and lead his people. But instead, he just unceremoniously just killed off. And then he doesn't save Cardassia. Cardassia is pretty much exterminated by the Dominion. And that's amazing storytelling to me. Not only does it subvert expectations, but it does it in the best way possible. It does it by presenting the uselessness, just the nonsensical nature of war. There is, in real life, there is no narrative purpose for war. It's just a chaotic, terrible thing that should be avoided at all costs, and how the fortune can change just like that. And at first, I remember when I first watched this episode when I was a teenager, or I was like 19, 20 at the time, but whatever. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about this, because it's not what I was used to seeing in my fiction. I was used to seeing the good bad guys defeat the bad guys, and the good Damar, who's fighting for his freedom, will defeat the evil Dominion and lead his people to a new. Because that's what I was so used to seeing, and so it really caught me off guard that he was just unceremoniously, just like that, just out of nowhere. Like, nothing spectacular. He was just storming the castle, and all of a sudden, boom, he's dead. I was shocked, and so at first I didn't really like it because I just wasn't used to it. But after having years to look back on it and analyze it, I actually think it's a stroke of brilliance. And of course, it is what makes Deep Space Nine unique and a masterpiece and one of the best television shows that ever was. In fact, I once called this the greatest science fiction show of all time, which, I don't know if I'm still completely firm on, especially now that The Expanse is around, but it's up there. It's definitely up there. And it's reasons like that, because they did not go with stereotypical Hollywood convention, and they showed more of a realistic grittiness that is maybe more depressing, but also showcases the chaotic nature of war and how it's something that should be avoided at all costs, which, by the way, is a very, very Star Trek message. And that's why Star Trek typically avoided showing war, as because Star Trek's message was always that war was not a good thing. It was not something to be glorified. So, and a lot of people was against DS9 for having war in Star Trek, which they thought was very un-Star Trek-like. But they did it in a very Star Trek-esque way, which is to not glorify it and to show it as something that should be avoided at all costs. And I love the interactions we get between Kira and Garrick. Garrick is still my favorite character of Deep Space Nine, and I particularly love the scene. At first, it strikes me as a bit awkward, but I still really love this scene where they go to the Dominion headquarters to try to kill or capture the female changeling, and they can't even get through the door, and they find out that the explosives they brought with them aren't even going to make a dent on the door, so then Garrick just randomly starts laughing, and they're like, what the fuck are you laughing at? And then Kira starts laughing along with him the more he explains. It's like, well, isn't it obvious? We're here, to slay the Dominion beast in its lair, willing to give our lives, and we can't even get through the door. And then they all start laughing, and they're like, well, maybe we should just knock on the door and ask the female changeling to let us in. And then Damar gets in the spirit. Like, or have them bring the changeling out to us. I like that scene. It did seem a bit awkward at first, but the more I think about it, the more I like it. The more that it does show they're in this really serious situation, but how they're completely fucked, and they would kind of get delirious and just laugh at themselves. But of course they did, eventually get through the door because the Dominion were stupid enough to open the door in order to kill that Cardassian puppet guy. Now this I can't even remember his character, the name of this character, but the Cardassian, he was the leader, took over after Damar. He was only introduced in the episode previous to this one, so he only appeared in these 2 episodes, and he's a pretty not important character, but it's important to have this character is because he is a stereotypical type puppet leader that dictatorships will install once they conquer a people. When they conquer their people, they'll put a leader, and for a while that's who Damar was, but then of course Damar was, when it became more and more obvious that Damar, that's what he was, that he was just a figurehead, just a puppet leader, he was very much against that, and that it had left a bad taste in his mouth and led him to revolting, where this guy was very, very happy to be a puppet leader, and yet they executed him anyway because, well, basically he failed at his job because the Cardassian military and the people of Cardassian started revolting against the Dominion. So he was kind of useless, even though he was like, I'm loyal to the Dominion. He was. I agree, and I think that that maybe they knew this to be true, but they saw that he was a complete failure, and nobody really liked this guy. And so watching this character is really hard because I kind of feel bad for him at the same time. He's so despicable, but he is based off of real life people that dictatorships do. When they conquer a country or territory, they emplace someone from that territory and pretend that they're their leader, but they're really just a puppet. So that's so that was really interesting. So the battles itself, all the space battles had been criticized because they did reuse a lot of footage. Particularly, you could spot footage from episodes like Sacrifice of Angels and the, I think it's called Tear of the Prophets, the season 6 finale. You see other, those episodes that also featured, heavy space battles with the Dominion. And even there was one that I thought was very obvious to me as a Star Trek nerd. I recognized it right away where they showed these Klingon ship getting destroyed, and the interior of the Klingon ship where the whole ship was blowing up, and the Klingons were jumping and being engulfed by flames, was from the movie Star Trek Generations. I spotted that right away. But, I ultimately don't mind because I understand they don't have a a big budget, like a blockbuster movie. And in fact, they did have a lot of original special effects, which this episode was, even with the reuses of all that footage, was still ridiculously expensive to make. And they did have some original footage, such as when the Starfleet fleet did surround Cardassia, and Cardassia was surrounded by all those Breen and Jem'Hadar ships, and there were other various, war battles scenes that were obviously original footage. So I do not begrudge them reusing footage at all. It still works for me. Like, it still really gets me involved in this epic, space battle, that this is the end of the war, and this is the Starfleet, surrounding Cardassia and ending the war, and has that. I still get caught up, especially when they intermix it with the scenes with the Defiant crew on the Defiant. It works for me. So I don't mind. So it doesn't bother me in the least. I still love the space battles. Now, bringing it back a bit to the start of the episode, it begins with Bashir and Ezri in bed, which takes off from the previous episode. Now, it seems like every finale of a Star Trek show, or at least for in the 90s, would have to put two main characters together who hadn't really been together, except for maybe it was teased at a little bit before in the final season, and all good, and TNG and All Good Things, it was Worf and Troy, and in Voyager, it was Chakotay and Seven of Nine. Now, the Chakotay and Seven of Nine, as I said, I don't need to get into how much Endgame sucked, and that sucked. I was like, that was by far the worst pairing romance that Star Trek has ever done, ever. So the less said about that, the better. Worf and Troy, maybe it was not as bad, but it was still bad. I still didn't like it. Now, I have stated disagreements with several people in the past about Ezri and Bashir, because many did not like it. And overall feels like the fan base is kind of mixed on them. I love them together. I think by far this is the only one of those three romances introduced in the finale that actually worked for me, and I think it really works for me. Now, I understand people's trepidation on this because Bashir had a crush on Jadzia, and so some people feels a bit weird that he's just transferring his feelings from Jadzia to Ezri, which I get, but I don't feel is the case. I feel like the show itself had earned that these two characters get along a lot better than Jadzia and Julian ever did, because Ezri is more of Julian's type, to be honest. And I think to me that's very clear, that she's more of the shy, more of like the sort of uncertain and goofy, for lack of a better term, than Jadzia ever was, and makes her a much better match for Julian. And I think that the two of them relate on that level, and that Julian, his feelings for her are for her and not for Jadzia, because I think she's a much better match for him than Jadzia ever was. And so I disagree with those saying that he was just, this is just awkward because he's just transferring his feelings from Jadzia to her. I think that is clearly not the case. And seeing these two together in this episode, I'm reminded of how well they do work off each other and do feed off each other. I think these are two and the chemistry to me is undeniable between these two characters, especially towards the end when they have them talking about how she wants to join the Alamo holograms, but that was Bashir's like, no, I can't. That was me and O'Brien's things. I can't do that with you. But here's another program that is very similar to that. We can start that one. Like that kind of chemistry that they had. To me, it works. So I don't care what anyone says. I think this is one of the favorite pairings of two main characters they put together in a romance in all of Star Trek. And it's funny because He's talking about that horrible Endgame crap again. When there was a novel that took place after Endgame, the first thing they did, rightfully so, because everyone can see that Chakotay 709 thing was just a piece of shit and horrible, and these characters had absolutely no chemistry together whatsoever. The first thing that novel did was to separate them two and have them break up. And I was like, thank God. But when we had DS9 had a series of novels, actually, pretty interesting, actually, that took place after this final episode. They also, one of the first things they did was to separate Julian and Ezri, and that I disagreed with. That I was in the wrong. I was like, no, you shouldn't do that. These characters are actually good together. You shouldn't separate them. And I do feel a bit of a justification, because in the documentary, when what's it called? What We Left Behind. Is that what it's called? Yeah, What We Left Behind. I had to look at the poster to confirm that. Ira Stephen Barrett, some of the DS9 writers, came up with this fictional season 8, and Ezri and Julian were still together after, I believe, 20 years. And I was like, yes. Even though the rest of that fictional season 8 sucked, it was pretty terrible, that was the one thing I was like, yes, thank you. I felt validation in that they would still be together after so long. So I actually prefer that to the novel that decided to separate them and eventually made Ezri a captain, which I think was a bit ridiculous. But anyway, but there was other parts of those novels that I did actually really like. So, but that's the aspect I didn't like. But anyway, God, what else is there to talk about this episode? I guess I'm going to talk about the Winn and Dukat thing. Now, I don't hate this storyline as much as a lot of people do, because a lot of people thought it was out of Wynn's character for her to all of a sudden reject the prophets and embrace the power race. I don't. I think it's absolutely in her character, because Winn from the beginning was portrayed as someone who just is, all they want is power. They're ambitious, they want power. They use religion as an excuse to gain this power and wealth and power. And this is based off of a lot of real life people, not only in modern times, but also throughout history. And so this rings very true to me, that she doesn't actually give a fuck about the actual religion that she claims to be a proponent on. It's more about power and ambition. And so, and in fact, the one episode that these people who are against this, they say, oh, the episode, the Rapture, I think it was called, Rapture, where Winn devotes her loyalty to the prophets, and that actually helps Cisco. That's the episode I think she was out of character. She would never do that, because she actually doesn't give a fuck about the prophets. All she cares about is her own wealth, power, ambition. That's it. And there's a lot of real life religious figureheads in modern times and throughout history who absolutely are like that. So this character rings very true to me like that. And so, and in fact, I think this arc did an amazing job of displaying this by showing how Winn was, at first when she heard this power race, this was in conflict with everything she'd been told and taught her whole life about the prophets. But as soon as Kira laid it out to her and was like, well, just give up your power and relinquish your power and devote yourself to the prophets, she's like, fuck that. I'm not giving up my power, because that's the only thing she cares about. The religion was just an excuse for the ambition and the power. So I think this made the most sense for her character, and that she would even go as far as to team up with the most despicable man known to Bajor Gul Dukat, because she wants her fucking power. And so I think this 100% fits with her character, and in fact I loved it as a storyline. It just showed how corrupt and how much she doesn't actually care about the actual religion she purports to be a proponent for. But the storyline over in this arc was not done the best, particularly with the pacing, because they had a lot of setup And it was clear that the writers hadn't planned this out because they were going through that storyline too fast, so they had to like pause, have Dukat go blind, and just write off the storyline for like several episodes. And now he comes back, all of a sudden he can see again, and it's obviously was just an excuse to pause the storyline because they were blowing through it too quickly. That I agree with. It was poorly paced, and also overall, looking at the storyline, it does seem to be a lot of setup for very little payoff. And so I will agree in that regards as well, because it was a bit anticlimactic that this whole thing they've been building up for many, many episodes is just Sisko comes in and destroys the book and it's over. I do feel like it needed a lot bigger stakes and bigger payoffs than what we got. It did seem to be a lot of build up for very little payoff. But I do think it did fit perfectly with Kai Wynn's character, and as for being a confrontation between Dukat and Sisko, I think it worked. Now, Kai Wynn did at the end help Sisko defeat Dukat at the cost of her own life, but that's because she lost her power at that stage anyway, and it was more about a spite for losing her power. That's my interpretation of it. But anyway, so I think it's perfectly, for as far as character story goes, it makes tons of sense. It was just, it should have had bigger payoff than what they did have. That simply, Dukat comes in with these magical powers like, bow before me, and then Kai Wynn distracts. I do look kind of like how Sisko was able to defeat Dukat because he was distracted by killing Kai Wynn. That was kind of cool, but it all happens like too fast. It was too quick of a payoff to justify all of the build up that they had for it, and it was kind of a bit silly. Remind me of like Gollum jumping into Mount Doom or whatever, and Lord of the Rings, even though this came out first. Well, movie version, obviously the books had been out years before this. But anyway, I hadn't read the books at this stage. It wasn't. But anyway, regardless, it did remind me of that. It wasn't. And overall, I didn't like. I think Ira Stephen Bear was a bit silly for wanting to make Sisko a god, and that they could have probably done without that whole storyline. But that being said, I don't hate it. As I said, I think the episode probably would have been better off without it. But even if it's there, it's not the blemish on this episode. It's fine. It doesn't it doesn't actively interfere with how good this episode is, like some other scenes I'm about to get to. Now, before I do that though, sticking with the whole Sisko thing about him going off with the prophets, again, this kind of stays with the bittersweet tone of Deep Space Nine, and to me kind of makes sense. Even though, again, it's not necessary, and I could have done without it. It fits, so it doesn't bother me in the least. Some people are bothered by the fact that Cassidy is the one who says goodbye that Benjamin says goodbye to Cassidy instead of Jake. And I get that the Jake and Sisko relationship is something that the show has always hinged on, so I do agree that's kind of a missed opportunity. But it doesn't bother me as much, especially because they end the whole show, like the final scene of the entire show is with Jake looking out into space, mourning the loss of his father. So to me, that kind of makes up for it. So, I mean, I get what they're saying, and I'm not going to disagree that it should have been Jake rather than Cassidy, but it doesn't bother me. To me, I'm satisfied with how they did it. Okay. Let's get into the Vicness of it all. So, I don't want anyone to get confused and think that I don't like the farewell scenes or them saying goodbye, and I think that the whole show should have just ended abruptly after the Dominion War. I do not, and I hope I made that clear during my introduction. Like the scenes that we get with Odo saying goodbye to Kira, as I said, that's one of the best scenes in all of Star Trek. It brings me to tears. Kira and Odo, by the way, another pairing which a lot of people were very poo-pooing writing that I love. That's another one of my favorite, putting two Star Trek characters together. I mean, the way they did it in season 6 was a tad bit awkward, especially that first kiss that was very awkward. But the kiss in this episode, and of course the episodes building up to this, like tacking into the Winn, was really powerful and getting totally, I think season 7 saved their relationship from its rocky beginnings in season 6, especially because it involved a certain character, Vic Fontaine. Anyway, so I love the Odo-Kira relationship, and I think this episode cements it as one of the best relationships in Star Trek, because this was a very touching, very sad departure where Odo walks into the I'm postponing talking about Vic. I'm just delaying. I'm procrastinating on that. But anyway, that end where Odo walks into the Great Link and he's in that suit and he waves goodbye, that brings the tears to my eyes. It's very effective. Very effective. So absolutely, I did need that. It's good seeing Julian and O'Brien say goodbye. That was great. Having Worf go off to be an ambassador, that's good stuff. And even having the big farewell dinner where Sisko gives his speech, about how they're the best crew he ever served with, and they're gonna really remember that. But you end it there. You don't have a fucking 5-minute sequence of a freaking cheap Frank Sinatra cover. In fact, I honestly think this scene would have made more sense than Quark's Bar. Now, apparently the producers had considered putting in a Quark's Bar, but rejected it. Idea, and part of it is because they wanted to have all the cameos, because if you look at all the cameos of all the writers and producers and crew and some of the supporting actors without their makeup were dressed up as the 50s crowd of Vic's thing, and so they wanted that gimmick, and they thought that a gimmick wouldn't work if they had to dress up like aliens in Quark's Bar, which I don't really care about that. I just don't want Vic to be in it. Vic should have never been in the show, period. Especially being introduced at such a late stage. He's a terrible character. He wastes time singing these crappy Frank Sinatra covers that is... DS9 is not a variety show. It should not be a variety show. We should not be spending 5 minutes listening to this fucking Frank Sinatra knockoff sing terrible songs. And on top of that, as I mentioned, the cheesy montages that we go when they have all the flashbacks of the various scenes. To me, that's something I talk about a lot in Discovery, over sentimentality. That's something that Deep Space Nine has never done, really, except for this moment. And it was just too much. You don't need it. It's overkill. Having the Odo and Kira say goodbye, and having O'Brien and Bashir say goodbye, and having Worf say goodbye, that's powerful enough on its own. Having these visual flashbacks played to cheesy Frank Sinatra music is just a contrived, over-the-top attempt to pull those heartstrings when you already effectively pulled out the heartstrings, and you're undermining the effective farewells that you already gave by overdoing it. And so this, to me, way more than the Dukat and Kai Winn stuff, ruins the episode. Or not, it doesn't ruin the episode. As I say, I still love it. It's still my top 10. But it prevented it from being number 1. I can't consider this my favorite episode of Deep Space Nine because of this crap. And I can't consider it the best finale. But I think I would have considered this an even better finale than even Breaking Bad or All Good Things, had it not been for this crap. This crap actively reduces what would have been otherwise a perfect episode and one of the best episodes of any show of all time. Even with the Dukat stuff, even with that stuff, still could have been one of the best episodes of all time. But this disqualifies it. It's over sentimentality, pulling on the heartstrings, having these crappy Vic Fontaine shouldn't fucking be in the show, and it's And actively. Now, a lot of people complain about the fact that Worf's flashbacks in particular were stupid because it doesn't feature the one character he cared most about, Jadzia, and this was for legal reasons, because apparently they used an audio clip of Jadzia's voice in an earlier episode that was started out this arc, this ending arc, and they didn't get permission, and so the actor, her agent, whatever, was furious and demanded a lot more money than the show could afford to use her image, and so they didn't. In which case, they shouldn't, at the very least, even if they insisted on doing these cheesy montages, which I think they shouldn't have, they at the very least shouldn't have done Worf. Because if they can't have access to Jadzia's footage, then don't do Worf, because his footage it includes like him fighting Gowron and hanging upside down with Ezri on the breen and kissing Ezri of all people, who he never really had romantic feelings and saw that relationship as a mistake, and footage of him like smoking a cigar in the Bashir James Bond episode. The problem with that is that wasn't Worf. That was just his image that was being used in the hologram. So yeah, the Worf thing was a complete debacle. At the very least, they shouldn't have done Worf. But the whole concept of any of them, even though the Jake one does kind of work for me, they still shouldn't do it. It is overkill, especially having Jake look out the window and Kira comes up and hugs him, like, and the whole Odo going to the link and saying goodbye. Like, each of these departures have their own powerful, sentimental goodbyes. By having this, which is contrived and obviously pulling at those heartstrings, undermines it and undercuts the kind of goodbyes that the show should have had. So yeah, to me, that's easily the worst. Well, that and Vic fucking singing his damn songs, easily the worst part of this finale. And easily, it is what holds it back from being like my favorite episode of Deep Space Nine. Anyway, my rating for What You Leave Behind out of 10, despite the Vic Fontaine-ness and his cheesy montage, I am still gonna give this a 10, the best. Now, granted, when I give episodes a 10, I don't use decimal points. So I either give it a 9 or a 10. There's no in between for me. And so this was very close to getting a 9. But the first part of it is just so good, so strong. Some of the best, like the way that it ended the Dominion War, some of the best storytelling I've ever seen in any Star Trek thing ever. So that's what slightly pushes over the edge of that 10 rather than a 9. But to be clear, this is like a 9.6, not a perfect 10. But I don't do 0.5s or point anything, so this is a 10. The best. It is one of my favorite Deep Space Nine episodes, still, despite its flaws, and it is one of the best series finales of all time, despite its flaws. It is like a million, trillion, billion, tillion, quadrillion times better than the Voyager finale. Yeah, it's how you end the show. It is, well, most of it is how you end the show, and most of it does stay true to the heart of Deep Space Nine. So that is it for my review of What You Leave Behind. Thanks so much for watching this. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment if you like. Also, be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek videos, doing lots of Star Trek retro reviews, as well as reviewing current Star Trek such as Discovery and Picard, as well as covering many other shows such as The Expanse, Star Wars, The Clone Wars, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks so much for watching.